I never thought the sound of engines would break my heart, but that morning, it did. It was just past dawn when I heard it. Diesel engines roaring where there should have been nothing but bird song. I rushed out to my porch in my slippers, clutching my coffee, and froze. My land, the pasture my father left me, the place where I'd buried my first dog, the soil I'd worked with my bare hands, was crawling with bulldozers. Men in hard hats were hammering stakes, marking the earth like it was theirs. Cement trucks lined up on the road like an invading army. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. But then I saw the fresh cuts in the grass, the survey flags snapping in the breeze, and the look on one man's face when he caught me staring. It wasn't the look of someone making a mistake. It was the look of someone who knew exactly what he was taking. I stormed down the hill, my slippers sinking into the damp ground, my voice cracking as I shouted, "What are you doing on my property?" A woman with sharp sunglasses and a clipboard turned to me. She had that calm, polished smile I would later come to know too well, the smile of someone used to steamrolling over objections. "This land," she said, "is part of an approved housing development. The HOA is overseeing construction. You'll be compensated, compensated." That word cut deeper than any blade. As if my family's legacy, the place my father swore would stay in our name, was just a line item in their budget. I held up my hands, pointing to the old wooden fence that had stood longer than any of them had been alive. "This is my land. I have the deed. You can't just come in here with your machines and—" She interrupted me without a blink. "Sir, the paperwork is already in motion. If you have concerns, take it up with the county. For now, please step aside. You're obstructing our progress." Her words hit me harder than her tone. Progress. That's what they called it. But I didn't see progress. I saw theft. I stumbled back toward my porch, my heart hammering. From there, I watched in horror as they tore into the soil. My soil. Every shovelful felt like a betrayal. Memories flickered in my mind. My father teaching me how to plant corn on that land. My mother hanging laundry in the summer sun. The long evenings I'd spent alone under the stars after they were both gone. That land wasn't just dirt. It was my bloodline. But in the eyes of that HOA, it was nothing more than real estate. The first house went up so quickly it made me sick. A wooden frame one week, siding and shingles the next. Then another. And another. I couldn't stop it. I called the county office, waving my deed like a weapon, but every official brushed me off. "It's complicated," they said. "Let the courts decide." Meanwhile, the sound of hammers and saws became my daily torment. I tried speaking to my neighbors, but they avoided my eyes. Some whispered that I was being difficult, standing in the way of growth. Others told me to take whatever payout they offered and move on. They didn't understand it wasn't about money. It was about respect, about principle, about the promise I made to my father when he lay dying. Never let this land leave our name. One evening, I stood at the edge of the construction site, watching families tour half-finished homes. Children ran through open frames, their laughter echoing through beams nailed into my earth. That's when I realized how deep this theft had gone. The HOA wasn't just building houses. They were building lives on a foundation that wasn't theirs to give. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with every deed, every record, every scrap of paper proving my ownership spread before me. My hands shook with rage and helplessness. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't rich. I was just one man staring down an army of machines and contracts. But as I stared at those papers, something inside me hardened. They thought I was powerless. They thought I would roll over, take their check, and vanish. They thought wrong. I didn't know how yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would not let them win. If they wanted to build 120 homes on my land, then fine. Let them. I'd wait. I'd watch. And when the time was right, I'd tear their empire down with nothing but the truth. And as the machines roared into the night, I whispered to myself, "This isn't over." Not by a long shot. I woke the next morning to the same mechanical roar, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just the sound of theft, it was a challenge. I brewed coffee with trembling hands, stared out at my land, and realized that the quiet I had known was gone forever. 120 homes were rising on my property, and no one seemed willing to stop them. I decided I couldn't sit back any longer. I grabbed my father's old leather briefcase, packed every deed, every survey, every tax record I could find, and marched into the HOA office. The place smelled of polished wood and arrogance. I handed over my documents to the receptionist, expecting at least a flicker of acknowledgement. Instead, I got laughter. One of the board members, a tall man in a gray suit with a voice like gravel, leaned back in his chair and said, "Mr. Harris, these things happen all the time. We'll work something out. You'll be compensated." I slammed my hand on the counter. "You don't understand. You're building on my land. 120 houses. You can't just—" He raised a hand. "Sir, take a breath. The lawyers say everything is above board. Our records are fine. You need to accept that. Above board, fine?" My hands shook so badly that I almost dropped my papers. I realized in that moment that reason alone would not stop them. They weren't going to see the truth, not even when it was shoved in their faces. Back at home, I watched through binoculars as construction crews poured the next foundation. My anger boiled into something heavier, something cold and calculating. I felt like a man trapped in a cage, pacing while the predators roamed freely. But I wasn't truly powerless. Not yet. That evening, I called the county offices again. I demanded to speak with anyone who could help me stop this. Every time, the line went dead or a voice said, "Legal matters take time." Time. They had all the time in the world, and I had none. 120 houses were already halfway built, and each day my chances of regaining my land shrank. I began to investigate, piecing together their approvals, permits, and contracts. I spent hours in the local archives, scanning old HOA filings and zoning maps. And then, like a crack of lightning, I found it, a single overlooked detail that made my heart race. A mistake in the HOA's chain of title. A small clerical error that, if challenged correctly, meant the land wasn't legally theirs. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. I knew this was dangerous. These people had lawyers for every loophole, connections for every obstacle. If I made a misstep, I could lose everything. But at least there was a crack, a way in. And I decided I would find it and pry it wide open. Meanwhile, the HOA seemed oblivious. They were gloating quietly, sending out glossy mailers about your dream home in a prime neighborhood, completely ignoring the fact that those dreams were built on stolen ground. I drove past the site one afternoon and saw a family measuring a yard for a swing set. A little boy laughed and ran to a dog in the grass, and I felt a pang of guilt. I wasn't trying to hurt people, but I couldn't let sentiment stop me. If I didn't act, my father's land would be gone forever, so I began the quiet war. I wrote letters demanding meetings, I researched property law until my eyes burned, and I started keeping a detailed journal of every interaction with the HOA. Every refusal, every condescending smile, every attempt to brush me off, I recorded it. I knew it would matter later. Evidence is patience, I told myself. Evidence is revenge, but they weren't going to wait for me to figure it out. One afternoon, I noticed a surveyor snapping photos along my property line. Not measuring, not checking permits, just documenting. My stomach dropped. Were they planning to forge something? Alter a line in their favor? My pulse raced. I had to move faster. That night, I sat at my desk, a single lamp casting shadows over my papers. I sketched out plans, notes in margins, legal clauses, ideas that seemed almost too big to work. I realized something terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I could fight them. I could make them pay, not just stop them, not just reclaim the land, but bring their empire to its knees. But it would take patience, cunning, and no mistakes. One wrong move and all of it could collapse. As I stared at the faint glow of the construction lights in the distance, I whispered to myself, "You think you own me? But you have no idea what's coming." And in that whisper, I felt a strange calm. The roar of the machines was no longer just anger. It was a challenge, and I was ready to accept it. The days blurred into weeks, and the machines never stopped. Every morning, I watched from my porch as 120 houses grew taller, their walls rising like a mocking monument to my helplessness. And yet, beneath the anger, something had shifted in me. I wasn't just watching anymore, I was planning. Every setback, every sneer from the HOA, every condescending letter I received became a building block for what I began to call the trap. It started with research. I spent hours poring over county archives, zoning records, and obscure property statutes that most people would never read. I learned the language of permits, easements, and legal loopholes. The HOA thought they were untouchable, but their arrogance was exactly what made them vulnerable. The more I dug, the more mistakes I found. Permits missing signatures, approvals granted under questionable authority, and even a single surveyor's map that didn't match the recorded boundaries. At first, I couldn't believe it. Could this be real? One slip here, one oversight there, and suddenly the entire development was built on shaky ground, legally speaking. My pulse raced with a mix of fear and exhilaration. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had the upper hand. But it wasn't enough to just know. I had to act carefully. One wrong move and the HOA's lawyers would crush me. I started documenting everything: photos of encroaching foundations, videos of construction crews ignoring my signs, detailed notes of every interaction with the board. Each entry was meticulous, each detail another thread in the web I was weaving. This wasn't revenge yet, it was preparation. Patience had become my weapon. Then the first twist hit. One afternoon, as I walked along the edge of the property, I noticed something strange. Survey markers had been moved. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to shift the boundary lines by a few inches here, a few feet there. My stomach sank. They were trying to cover up their mistake. I confronted the crew, my voice shaking with rage. "Who authorized this?" I demanded. The foreman shrugged. "Just following the plans, sir. Plans. My father's land, the only home I had left, was being redrawn while I slept." I felt a surge of helplessness, but it quickly hardened into determination. If they thought they could outsmart me with small tricks, they were about to find out how dangerous patience could be. That night, I called my attorney. I had been hesitant to involve one too early, afraid it would alert the HOA. But now, with the shifting markers and the speed of construction, I knew I needed guidance. I explained everything: the moved markers, the missing signatures, the fraudulent permits. Her voice was steady on the other end. "Zane," she said, "if what you're telling me is accurate, you're sitting on a gold mine of leverage. We can stop this, but you have to act strategically. One misstep and they'll bury you." Her words settled on me like a cold wind. I wasn't just fighting machines or bureaucracy anymore. I was facing real human cunning, people willing to bend rules to break me. And yet the fear didn't paralyze me. It sharpened me. Over the next days, I became obsessed. I revisited every corner of the property, comparing old maps to new construction lines, photographing discrepancies, recording conversations with anyone who'd listen. I even spoke to some of the new homeowners discreetly, asking if they had received all proper paperwork. Most were blissfully unaware, trusting the HOA blindly. Some looked at me with suspicion, as if I were the problem. That stung more than anything. Then another twist came that almost broke me. I discovered the HOA had quietly filed for preemptive liens on some of my other properties, trying to pressure me into settlement. My pulse shot through the roof. They weren't just trying to steal my land, they were trying to destroy me completely. My nights became sleepless, haunted by visions of my family's legacy being erased. But each time despair threatened to swallow me, I reminded myself of the trap I was building. Every mistake they had made was a thread I could pull, and when I pulled it, their entire empire could unravel. By the end of that week, I had a plan forming in my mind, a way to expose every flaw, every fraudulent signature, every inch of property built without consent. It wouldn't be easy. It would take timing, precision, and courage. But the thought of finally reclaiming my land gave me a strange clarity. I could almost see it. The day the HOA realized they were caught. The day their smug faces fell in court. The day my father's land was mine again. And yet, I knew I had to wait. The trap wasn't ready. 120 homes loomed like a ticking clock, each one a reminder that the wrong move could cost me everything. My anger burned hotter than ever, but now it was laced with calculation. Every hammer strike, every truck engine, every salesman showing a family their new dream home only fueled my resolve. I whispered to myself late one night, staring at the dark horizon. You think this is just land? You think you own me, but you're wrong. You've built your empire on sand, and when the time comes, it will collapse, and I'll be the one holding the blueprint. I didn't sleep much that night, but I didn't need to. I was ready to wait. I was ready to strike. And most importantly, I was ready to prove that no one, no matter how powerful, could touch what was rightfully mine. I still remember the day I first stepped into that courtroom. The walls smelled faintly of polished wood and fear. Fear, I realized, was not just mine. The HOA board members were already there, seated in a row like children caught red-handed, their suits starched, their smiles forced. They didn't know it yet, but the tide was turning. I carried my briefcase with trembling hands, but my chest felt strangely light. All those sleepless nights, all the digging through archives and dusty permits, all the careful planning, it had led me here. And for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. This was my chance. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. I could hear my own heartbeat echo in my ears. When she finally spoke, her tone was calm, but it carried weight. We are here to address the property dispute between Mr. Harris and the Homeowners Association. Let's proceed. The HOA's lawyers opened first, their voices smooth, rehearsed. They painted me as an obstructionist, a man refusing progress, someone trying to stop a community from growing. I clenched my fists under the table. Lies. They had built 120 homes without asking me, and now they had the nerve to claim I was in the wrong? Then it was my turn. I laid out my evidence, one piece at a time. The missing signatures on permits, the discrepancies in surveyor maps, the illegal alterations to boundary markers, the fraudulent filings. I spoke clearly, deliberately, my voice growing steadier with each point. I could see the faces of the board members tighten. That smug confidence I'd seen for months began to crack. And then came the moment that changed everything. My attorney presented a letter I had never shared with anyone, a confidential memo from the HOA's own legal advisor, warning the board that the land title was flawed and that construction could be legally challenged. There it was in black and white. The HOA had been warned. They had known. The courtroom went silent. I watched as the board members' eyes darted to each other, panic growing where arrogance once sat. One of them whispered something I couldn't hear, but the desperation was clear. I felt a thrill I hadn't expected. They were finally scared. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Harris, you claim the HOA knowingly built on land you own. Can you substantiate this claim? I nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Not only did they build on land that was never legally theirs, but they ignored repeated warnings from their own counsel. This wasn't oversight. It was deliberate. The air in the courtroom felt heavy, almost electric. I could sense the shift. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about accountability, about exposing people who thought power and money could erase justice. Then came the twist that no one saw coming. One of the homeowners, a young woman who had recently moved in, stood up. Her voice was trembling. I didn't know any of this. I thought I was buying a home legally. I trusted the HOA. I just want to know, is my family going to lose everything? I froze for a moment. Her fear mirrored my own from months ago. All the planning, all the strategy, it wasn't supposed to hurt innocent families. My chest tightened. But then I realized something crucial. This was exactly why I had to win. If the HOA walked away, they wouldn't just take my land, they'd leave chaos behind. Families would be ruined because of their greed. I spoke carefully. You followed the rules as any buyer would. You didn't do anything wrong. But the HOA knowingly broke the law. That's why I'm here, to make sure justice is served without harming people who weren't part of the deception. The woman nodded, tears in her eyes. I could feel a weight lift, a sense of purpose sharpening. I wasn't just fighting for my land anymore. I was fighting for truth, for fairness, for every person misled by the people in that room. The HOA lawyers tried to counter, tried to twist my words, but it was too late. The evidence was stacked like a mountain, unmovable. The judge's eyes narrowed as she reviewed the documents I had painstakingly compiled. I could see it. Finally, the realization that the board had gambled recklessly and had lost. By the end of the day, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. The HOA board members sat frozen, their faces pale, whispers passing between them. I couldn't hear their words, but I could see the panic, the fear, the understanding that their empire had cracks too deep to repair. When the judge adjourned for the day, I stepped outside and took a deep breath. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the construction site. I could see the houses, the roads, the machinery, and for the first time I didn't see defeat. I saw possibility, but even in that moment of triumph, I knew the fight wasn't over. The HOA would appeal, they would hire more lawyers, they would try to bully their way out. The stakes had just risen. One wrong move now, and everything I had built, every shred of evidence, every painstaking strategy could be destroyed. I clenched my fists and whispered to myself, "This is it. The next few days will decide everything, and I'm not losing. Not now, not ever." I never thought I'd feel a sense of triumph watching destruction, but that's exactly what happened. It began early that morning. I arrived at the courthouse before sunrise, the air crisp and biting, carrying the faint scent of wet earth from my land. Families were already gathering outside, whispering anxiously, clutching papers and contracts, unsure of what awaited them. Their fear mirrored my own from months ago. I swallowed hard, reminding myself that this was bigger than just me. The courtroom was tense, almost suffocating. The HOA board members filed in last, looking smaller somehow, their smug confidence gone, replaced by a visible raw panic. They had realized that this wasn't just a case of paperwork. It was a reckoning. When the judge entered, silence descended like a blanket. I could hear my own heartbeat. Then she spoke, her voice cutting through the stillness. After reviewing all evidence, including deeds, permits, and testimonies, it is clear that the HOA knowingly built on Mr. Harris's property. The board is hereby held accountable for all legal infractions, and immediate action must be taken to rectify the situation. I felt my knees weaken. This was it. The culmination of every sleepless night, every painstaking note, every single ounce of patience I had stored. It was all coming to life. But the judge's words were just the start. Then came the most shocking moment. One by one, families who had moved into the homes began to testify. Not angrily, not in accusation, but with fear and confusion. One mother spoke through tears. "I didn't know. I trusted them, my kids. We might lose everything." Another young father added, "We invested our life savings. We didn't realize the truth." I looked at them, my heart twisting. I had never wanted to hurt anyone. But I knew their pain wasn't their fault. It was the HOA's greed that had placed them here. I stood and addressed them, my voice steady but full of emotion. "You didn't do anything wrong," I said. "The fault lies entirely with the HOA, who chose to ignore the law, to steal land that was never theirs, and to mislead you. I'm fighting so that your homes and your lives aren't destroyed by their arrogance." There was a pause. A collective exhale as if the room itself recognized the truth. I saw nods, teary eyes, hands gripping papers tightly. For the first time, I wasn't alone. The families became my witnesses, not my enemies. Then the judge made the next ruling, one I had only dared to hope for. The HOA's permits were nullified. All construction on my property was immediately halted, and the board was ordered to begin restitution payments. Every house that had been built without legal rights had to be vacated or renegotiated under proper terms, and the board would be personally responsible for covering the fallout. The room erupted, not in cheers, but in stunned emotional disbelief. Board members whispered to one another frantically, realizing the empire they had built was crumbling around them. I watched their faces, once confident and arrogant, now pale and anxious. Every sleepless night, every gamble they had made had led to this. And I had been patient enough to see it unfold. Outside the courthouse, chaos unfolded. News crews swarmed, families wept, and construction crews were already pulling equipment from the lots. I walked through the empty streets where homes had been partially finished, the sound of hammers replaced by silence, and the wind through unfinished walls. It was surreal. One moment, a bustling development, the next, a ghost town of ambition and greed. I caught sight of one board member attempting to slip away, but reporters stopped him. I didn't gloat. I didn't have to. Justice was playing itself out, and I was witnessing it firsthand. As I walked back to my property, the weight of what had just happened pressed on me. I hadn't only reclaimed my land, I had exposed a system built on arrogance, greed, and deceit. But with every victory comes responsibility. Families still had to be protected, contracts renegotiated, and the legal aftermath would drag on for months. I realized that even though the HOA had fallen, my work wasn't finished. Yet despite the exhaustion, despite the emotional storm swirling around me, a strange sense of peace settled over my chest. I had fought for something far more than land. I had fought for truth, for fairness, and for the memory of my father. That struggle had tested me, almost broken me. But in the end, it had forged something stronger. I walked through the empty lots, touching the wooden frames that had once been homes. I could almost hear the echoes of life that might have been, but I knew that nothing would ever again be taken from me without my knowledge. 120 homes had been built on my land, and 120 homes had been undone, not by brute force, but by patience, evidence, and persistence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over my reclaimed property, I whispered to myself, "You thought you could take everything. You thought you were untouchable. But this land, this legacy, no one steals from me and walks away." For the first time in months, I felt my shoulders relax. The storm had passed, at least for now. And yet, deep in my mind, I knew one truth. While the board was defeated, the world was full of people who underestimated patience and preparation. And I would never let that happen again. The weeks after the courtroom victory were surreal. My land was quiet again, the roar of machines replaced by the whisper of wind through the grass. The houses that had once risen like monuments to greed now stood empty, abandoned or dismantled. The sight was strange and almost eerie, but it felt like justice in its purest form. I spent days walking through the property, touching the soil, the fences, the old oak trees my father had planted decades ago. Each step was a reminder of what had been taken from me, and more importantly, what I had reclaimed. Not just property, but my sense of agency, my family legacy, my pride. The HOA was gone. Board members disappeared from town, some quietly relocated, others facing legal consequences for fraud and mismanagement. Their empire, once shiny and polished, lay in ruins. It was almost poetic. I didn't feel glee in their downfall, though I won't lie. There was a quiet satisfaction, but more relief. Relief that truth had finally prevailed, that justice had been served. Families who had unknowingly moved in were carefully assisted through the legal aftermath. They weren't victims of my revenge. They were victims of the HOA's arrogance. I made sure they knew they weren't alone, helping where I could to navigate their options. Many returned home, grateful that the truth had come to light before more damage could be done. Their faces, a mix of fear and hope, reminded me why I had fought so relentlessly. This wasn't just about land. It was about fairness, integrity, and standing up when no one else would. In the quiet evenings, I reflected on the months that had brought me here. I had been angry, scared, frustrated, and exhausted, but I had learned something about myself in the process. I realized that patience is more powerful than fury. That knowledge can be a sharper weapon than any threat, and that persistence, calculated, unwavering, can topple even the most arrogant opponents. I also learned that justice isn't always immediate. It doesn't always arrive with a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it requires careful preparation, watching, waiting, and knowing exactly when to act. The HOA had underestimated me because they measured strength only in money and influence, never in determination, preparation, and truth. And that mistake had been their undoing. I found myself walking to the highest point on my property, looking down at the empty foundations and quiet streets. For months, this view had been a nightmare, a monument to theft. Now it felt like a triumph. The land was mine again, free from those who thought power could erase history. I breathed in the cool evening air and felt a weight lift off my shoulders. But even in victory, I knew things would never be exactly the same. 120 homes had been built. 120 futures had been disrupted. And while the legal battle had restored my property, it had also reminded me of how fragile fairness can be, how quickly arrogance and greed can poison a community. I decided to make changes, not out of revenge, but out of stewardship. I began working with the county and neighbors to ensure the land would be protected, properly zoned, and respected for generations to come. I planted new trees, repaired fences, and even restored a small portion of the old pasture my father loved most. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine. It was about creating something lasting, something meaningful that could never again be threatened by greed. Occasionally, I hear people in town whisper about the Harris land or the HOA that fell. I don't seek recognition, but I allow myself a quiet smile. They think it's a story about victory, but it's more than that. It's a story about resilience, strategy, and refusing to be silenced. It's a story about how far one person can go when they refuse to back down, when they combine patience with action, and when they fight not just for themselves, but for truth. As the sun sets over the property now, golden light spilling across the grass, I sometimes sit on the porch with a cup of tea and simply watch. The land is peaceful again, the legacy of my father honored, the mistakes of the past corrected. And I feel a quiet pride, not in destruction, not in revenge, but in knowing that justice, patience, and persistence can shape the world, even against odds that seem impossible. I whisper to the wind, softly, almost to myself. You thought you could take everything. You thought I would give up. But this land, this legacy, belongs to those who protect it. And no one will ever take it from me again. And in that moment, I understand something profound. Sometimes, the sweetest victory isn't in defeating your enemies, it's in reclaiming your life, your heritage, and your peace.